history shows that if the dictators are emboldened and are not stopped, then eventually they will go elsewhere. On Ukraine specifically, I think there is a very strong consensus. In fact, it's almost entirely across Parliament. When we were in government, they gave us their backing. In government, we've done the same, and I think that's right. This is above politics. You're talking about a huge threat to our way of life if the situation there had ended earlier in the process. In other words, if Ukraine had fallen earlier, which is why it's so important that we helped them at the beginning. But the war goes on. 3 years tomorrow, as you and your listeners know, and we do need to somehow focus, despite all the noise this week, on how we keep giving them as much aid as possible. The way I look at it is to differentiate between what you might call noise, stroke rhetoric, and actual action, and what's going to actually happen. And at the moment, it's probably far too early to say that. I think that Donald Trump has been absolutely right to consistently argue, as he did previously, that we, and particularly other NATO countries, need to spend more on defense. I think that is a frustration for him, which in his case is clearly a huge frustration, and we've responded to that. We do need to do more heavy lifting, particularly against the Russian threat. It's been evident for some time with successive US administrations that understandably they are going to feel they need to focus on the threat from China. So I think that's been fair, that point. But on the wider implications, where we go with Ukraine, I think we've got to focus on one key message, and this is what I hope the Prime Minister will be saying to the President when he goes to the White House, which is that it's massively in the US interest that we stand together because in support of Ukraine, because if somehow Russia was seen to win from a settlement, should one happen, I think that would send a terrible signal to China and other potential adversaries, and I don't think that's in the interest of any NATO member, including the US. Of course I do, and history shows that if the dictators are emboldened and are not stopped, then eventually they will go elsewhere and they will look to other countries. And President Putin, to be fair, has been very open about his agenda, and his agenda has been to restore territory that Russia lost with the fall of the Soviet Union, this sort of almost like imperial idea. He's been very open about that. And so the worry will be that in other parts of Europe, potentially even NATO members, they will feel ever more threatened. That's why it's been important to help Ukraine contain Russia, not just because of the moral point that they're a democracy aggressively attacked without provocation by a dictatorship, but also because it is in our interest for the very reason you've just highlighted. I certainly think that one dynamic here is that President Trump was very clear in his campaign to the American people that he wanted to settle this quickly, and so there's huge energy there, and he is going through all the processes he wants in the order he wants to do them, and he's entitled to that. He has a mandate from his people, and we respect that. But I do think it is important, and I echo what the Prime Minister has said in his column today, that it has to be any deal has to be sustainable. It has to be able to last. And if it's rushed through and it simply results in greater insecurity, that's not really a meaningful peace, and that's what we actually need. But I do think we have to focus on the point that Ukraine still need to be supported. The war is still going on, terrible as that is. But I hope that ultimately the fact that it's in all our interests for every NATO member, including the US, to stand strong with Ukraine will prevail. Well, I think he's been very open about wanting to see a deal, as it were, in sort of transactional terms. That's for him. That's his priority. He clearly is going to stand up strongly for what he sees as the US interest, and we totally understand that. The point I just made, this dynamic about he wants to push for something quickly, means that there's he's using negotiating tactics, obviously. I know that's a statement of fact, but it's true in a way that hasn't been the case for those of us who've been who were previous administrations. Obviously he's new president, although he's previously in power. He's new in his second term, and he's come out of the blocks wanting to resolve this quickly, and he is taking this his unique negotiating approach, you might say. From our point of view, actually, The amount we gave is very significant relative to the size of our military. We've given probably more ordnance than any other nation. And I think that acted decisively at the beginning, not least both to protect Ukraine by providing those weapons even before Russia had actually crossed the border, and also by convening other nations. So we're very clear on our role. And that's why we want to see continued support for Ukraine. That's our priority. So what we've said today, and I have a column in one of the Sunday papers to this effect, and Kemi Badenoch, our leader, has written a letter to the Prime Minister setting this out. Yes, you're absolutely right. We had a plan at the election, which we announced last April, to go to 2.5% by 2030, funded by reducing the civil service back to its pre-pandemic size. And the crucial fact of that is it would have delivered an extra £10 billion for munitions. It's absolutely critical that we replenish our munition stocks because we've given so many to Ukraine for the right reasons, but they need to be replenished. And I'm afraid Labour has wasted time because it could have put that in place last July and started ordering the kit. Because the crucial point about that plan is that sophisticated missiles and weapons don't suddenly appear. They will take a few years to order. So you need to know what your funding is going to be over 2, 3, 4, 5 years. So we gave them that multi-year certainty. What I've said in my column today in the Sunday Express is that if 2.5% was right back in July, well, hold on a minute. With all that's happened recently, we are probably going to have to go further and faster. And I've accepted that today. And actually what Kemi has done in her letter is say to the Prime Minister, he will have to make some very difficult decisions on spending. That is now unavoidable, whatever happens. And we are willing to... So what I said in the article is that, we spelled out areas of spending that we would have to consider, that we think the government should look at. For example, the welfare budget. And I'm afraid in the short term, we may even have to look at the aid budget as well. And certainly not giving billions of pounds for this Chagos deal. But yes, my point is we had a plan to go to 2.5% by 2030 back in July. Well, since then, it's clear President Trump is very explicit. He wants European NATO countries, including the UK, to do more of the heavy lifting in Europe against the Russian threat. Clearly, US, as I said earlier, has been more focused on China for a long time. That's going to continue with President Trump. So that means we've got to go even further. And I think that's an unavoidable fact. I didn't put a percentage figure on it because I think that the important thing is the government are doing a strategic defence review. We will consider that when it comes out, and we'll do our own policy work on looking at where we need to spend that money, and then we will come out with a figure. I think the message we're trying to send today is we're serious. This is so important. Defence needs to be the top priority, and for that there will need to be some difficult decisions made. And Adam, and that's a really good point. It's a really good point because I think that's part of the argument in a way. You're right, it went from 0.7 to 0.5 when we were in government because of the cost of the pandemic. But you're right, it is seen as a form of dare I say, soft power to deliver security for the UK by helping developing countries become more stable, so that it's less likely that they become countries that will, cause problems that are eventually exported to us and become our problem. That's been the logic. And despite all the concern about some aid spending, there have been some extraordinary successes from, like the Gavi program to increase vaccination rates in developing countries, which has been extremely successful. But I just think we're up against now hard reality. It's the hard power that we need to increase. I'm afraid that's a stark fact. That is the military. And I think, therefore, if this budget is about the world being more secure, we have to accept that there is a strong argument now for moving some of it to defence. It wouldn't be under the aid budget. It would be part of the MOD so that we can fund that increase and do it in a prudent and sustainable manner. I mean, in terms of what you say, yes, we did talk about this with the Mauritians, but we never signed a deal. And we were clear that there were no acceptable terms on the table. And since then, frankly, the terms appear to have got worse. Indications there won't be any unilateral right to extend the lease, for example. But I think the key thing, and the public have picked up on this, it's the idea you've got a freehold on a UK-owned military base in Diego Garcia. Of course, it's important to the US, but we have a sovereign freehold on that base that we're now going to have to spend billions from the defence budget to rent back. And we just think in the current circumstances, it's more secure to have freehold status, we feel, but also we need that money, again, for investing in our own armed forces, because my key message today, we've got to get serious. You would have to go back and discuss with them alternative terms, but the idea of spending billions of pounds on leasing back the base that we currently own. I think that is unacceptable, especially in the current circumstances, pardon me, especially when you've got to fund the military to the level we will have to. And that's why, we don't support the deal that Labour are bringing forward. I sincerely hope not. I sincerely hope not, because it's been, as you say, a terrible human tragedy, extraordinary levels of suffering, death toll, and indeed for Russia, it's the sacrifice of their soldiers is just extraordinary into the so-called meat grinder. It's what happens when you have a dictator. But I think that we all hope that isn't the case, and we must do everything possible to stop that from being the case. And that means focusing on supporting Ukraine with continued resources in terms of the ongoing fight, and then doing everything possible to persuade international partners to stand by Ukraine, because it's in all our interests for every country in NATO, including the US.